Brian Thomas Jr. was the best rookie receiver from the 2024 draft class, and I fully expect him to be a premier all-pro caliber X in the very near future. This was a slam dunk pick for the Jags at 23. If I did a redraft, I would take Brian Thomas as the first non-quarterback off the board and potentially the first player depending on what team I was drafting for. I really can't overstate how impressive Thomas's tape was last year, and I'm excited to break it down. I think the sky is the limit for him going forward. So Brian Thomas is the prototype for a vertical X. He's 6'3", 210 with a 90th percentile wingspan, and he runs a 4.33. Those are probably the exact first traits you would start with if you were building a boundary receiver from scratch. You add on his release package and surprising hip fluidity for his size to get in and out of breaks. He was an easy first round grade, and he ended up as a top 15 player on my board. That probably doesn't qualify as a miss based on where he was drafted and where other people had him ranked. But when I self-evaluate based on the early returns from the 2024 class, Brian Thomas stands out as the first grade I would change if I could go back in time. I don't want to get too long-winded here, but he's a perfect example, in my opinion, of how prospect fatigue and overthinking are just nonsense buzzwords in draft discourse that will only misguide you if you buy into them. The handful of people who had the foresight to put Thomas or Malik Nabers ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. were lambasted for their prospect fatigue because they didn't defer to the player everyone else had already anointed as wide receiver 1. I had Harrison as wide receiver 1 just ahead of Nabers, and that opinion was based on film, but I really think I would have had Nabers as wide receiver 1 and Thomas Jr. a lot higher at least if I had evaluated them without any preconceived opinions or biases. It's obviously easy to say this kind of thing in retrospect, but if you just took a blind resume of their strengths and weaknesses, it's hard to see what exactly made Harrison a better prospect than the LSU guys. So Brian Thomas, I think, is a great reminder that if you want to be good at projecting draft prospects, you've got to proactively resist your own biases, try to go into each evaluation with as clean of a slate as possible, and then trust your evaluation even if it goes against conventional wisdom. Marvin Harrison Jr., I think, will be a really good fringe wide receiver 1 type of player, but after studying all of the rookies, he's a clear step below Thomas and Nabers. And I think I got a bit lazy and should have been more willing to deviate from my preseason view. So just wanted to start off the video with a quick shout out to the smart people that had Nabers or even Thomas ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. I thought I was going out on a limb ranking him 15th, but it turns out I was actually way too low. So like I was saying, Thomas is a built-in-a-lab X with rare size and rare straight line athleticism. Those foundational traits alone could make him a prime Martavis Bryant type of receiver, you know, high-end number 2 deep threat who can rack up explosive plays but has more of a specialized role in route tree. That's kind of how I viewed his most likely outcome heading into the season, but he came into the NFL with a significantly more well-rounded skill set than I was expecting, and after just 1 year, he's already exceeded my initial projection. It was no surprise that he was able to stretch the field and beat man coverage on go routes and deep posts. That's the most dominant aspect of his game, and it fully translated to the next level. But what caught me off guard was his polish and fluidity as an intermediate route runner. His lateral movement skills at LSU were a lot better than most 6'3" receivers, but I thought he was a bit clunky getting in and out of breaks, and his footwork and salesmanship at the top of routes was underdeveloped in college. But man, week 1, he runs this 7-stop against Miami, which at the time was probably the best route I had ever seen him run. And that growth just continued to snowball throughout his rookie year. He isn't like the guy I would point to as one of the best technicians in the NFL or anything, but he's a perfectly functional, capable route runner with still plenty of room to grow. So at a point in time in the NFL where I think there's a clear lack of dominant X receivers in the Julio Jones, Calvin Johnson mold, Brian Thomas is to me the one player that has a realistic shot of approaching that territory at least. But let's start with what he can do as a vertical threat, because that is the primary selling point of his game. It's funny, I just recorded a Malik Nabers video and I said very similar things about his production as I'm about to say about Brian Thomas. It's pretty amazing how productive they both were, and how much production was left on the field because their quarterbacks weren't worth a shit. Brian Thomas led all rookies last year with almost 1,300 receiving yards, third most receiving yards in the entire NFL. He also had 18 receptions of 20 plus yards, which was 8th most in the NFL, and his overall statistical profile was very impressive for a rookie. He ranked top 6 in yards per route run and wins above replacement, top 50 in the league in almost everything except for drop rate and broken tackle rate, where he was in the 50s. Looking at how his season stacks up historically, his yards per route run, 2.45, was 95th percentile among receivers since 2006. He was primarily used as Jacksonville's X, and in that role, he pretty much dominated on the vertical plane. He's got immediate burst off the line of scrimmage. If he gets off coverage, he's eating up that cushion at a threatening pace. If you try to press him, he's got that instant blow-by gear to stack man coverage in just a couple steps. He could honestly get off the line cleanly with just a simple speed release if he just used that every play. But he's actually got a pretty advanced, nuanced release package. For a tall, lanky receiver who you would think has a big strike zone for a press corner, he's surprisingly slippery at the line of scrimmage. He has the ideal blend of being able to effortlessly change pace when he's getting into his release and kind of soften a press corner with some hesitations or stutter steps, but you never feel like he's wasting time or doing too much dancing at the line of scrimmage. It's a really lethal combo of patience and decisiveness. If I have one question about him against press coverage, it would be that he's kind of unproven against physical, aggressive, early jams. I don't even say that as a criticism necessarily, because it's kind of a situation where he's suffering from success. Like when you watch him go up against press, he's mostly getting soft shoe press where they aren't jamming aggressively. They're just kind of patiently mirroring his release, making contact a few yards down the line of scrimmage once he declares his release. I'll break down these ratings in more detail at the end of the video, but I mean, I have him with a 96 press rating, which is elite, one of the best in the NFL. I wish he faced a little bit more contact and physicality at the line of scrimmage, but I don't blame corners for the way that they played him, because you slip up and lunge into a press jam, the moment you realize you're overextended, he's already stacked you by 3 yards. On top of the athleticism and release package, the other thing that makes him so dominant down the sideline is his ball tracking ability on over-the-shoulder throws. This is a beautiful rep from week 17, the rare play that he only creates marginal separation, but it doesn't end up mattering. He reels it in right over the defender's shoulder, basically plucks it off of his helmet. Similar kind of tight window ball tracking rep from later in the game, glides past him on a slot fade. Coverage isn't terrible, but it's a great throw and exceptional focus at the catch point to track this. And then there were a couple deep posts against like cover 3 where he had a defender right in his hip. In this first example especially, I mean, he's got Christian Gonzalez draped all over him at the catch point, still able to locate the ball, secure it through contact, and then also had a nice similar catch here against Greg Newsome, who kind of helped him out by not being able to find the ball. The home run ability that he has to outpace press man decisively made him a big play machine last year, and I think that will continue in the future. The frustrating aspect of his tape, though, was how much production was left on the field. Whether it was inaccurate deep targets or plays where he burned the corner immediately off the line and wasn't targeted, his rookie film was just an onslaught of quick, dominant wins that created massive separation, but the consistency of him getting the ball and the accuracy of the throws when he was targeted left a lot to be desired. Last year, he had 11 uncatchable targets of 20 plus air yards, which was the 4th most among NFL receivers. Mac Jones was pretty useless, as you would expect, but Trevor Lawrence needs to pick up his game. I've always been a slight Lawrence defender. I think a lot of his early struggles especially weren't really his fault. He's got all the talent, but got to start delivering at some point. This play toasts Kamari Lassiter on a stop and go. We're talking 6-7 yards of separation streaking into the end zone. Lawrence overshoots him by like 3 or 4 yards. Right here, easily gets on top of the boundary corner. Again, 4 or 5 yards of separation. Gets overthrown by 3 or 4 more yards. This time it was Mac Jones. His explosiveness and acceleration are truly elite, and it makes him such a weapon on double moves because he can gear up and down with almost no delay. He doesn't have quite the joystick start-stop ability of somebody like Malik Neighbors, but if we're talking about 2, maybe 3 speed changes throughout the play. He executes that so smoothly, and just an average NFL athlete really isn't equipped to keep up with him. You see right here, just a smooth sluggo, glides over the top of Jack Jones, 3 or 4 yards of separation, and it looks like he could have done that in his sleep. This play actually results in an interception. I mean, this is a clear win from Brian Thomas Jr.'s standpoint, and yet another play that should have been a touchdown, but they ended up with nothing. Another just casual rep, stacking an all-pro corner and press man. This play, I really like the design, and I guess not really the design, but the specific usage of Brian Thomas Jr. here. Sending him on these motions where he has the space to build up to like 50 or 60% of his max speed before he even crosses the line of scrimmage. It's just uncoverable from a defensive standpoint, especially if you're able to also use that motion to manipulate the coverage rules and get him matched up with a linebacker. Brian Thomas in a foot race against a linebacker that probably runs 4.7, 4.8, and Thomas gets a running start into his route. That's just an all-time insurmountable mismatch, which ultimately doesn't matter if the quarterback underthrows it by 7 yards. So big guy run fast is basically the cliff notes for that section, but there is so much more to Brian Thomas Jr.'s game. He separates consistently down the field, but also as an intermediate route runner. Still some things to clean up kind of around the edges, but he is well on his way to being a complete receiver with a well-rounded skill set that could be borderline unstoppable if he reaches his potential. Vertical routes did lead to the majority of his production, but they actually didn't make up as much of his route tree as I initially expected, at least. Only 25.1% of his routes last year were go routes or posts. That was the 74th highest rate out of 132 qualifying receivers. Definitely a critical part of his game, but he isn't just running 30 yards down the field every play like I kind of expected him to coming out of college. But considering how often he got open on those routes and wasn't targeted, the Jags coaching staff kind of did him a solid, just saving him from the extra cardio. The rest of his route tree primarily consisted of hitches and stops, which were 21.3% of his routes. He ran outs and ins 14.4% and 11.9% of the time, respectively. And then the quick slant was only 3.3% of his route tree, but it was his most dominant route by far. I mean, completely uncoverable on quick slants. That's got to be a part of his route tree that gets expanded under Liam Cohen. I mean, if you get him lined up with single coverage, you've basically got an automatic 10-yard gain whenever you want it. So out of those 4 remaining routes, the hitch, slant, in, and out, he ran the first 3 at an extremely high level. Very much a pleasant surprise in that phase, but his out routes were actually pretty clunky and ineffective, and I would point to that as one of the 2 key areas of improvement heading into next year. But let's start with his good routes. One of Brian Thomas Jr.'s best plays from last season was this short post touchdown in the red zone. Looking at his initial relationship with the defender, he's playing with slight inside leverage, so he's shaded probably a yard to the inside, but at the snap, the defender immediately evens out that leverage, squares up with Brian Thomas. At this point in the route, as he's crossing about the 8-yard line, he's relatively square with his opponent. He's running an in-breaking route, and to set that route up, he's got to do something to either get the corner to open his hips to the sideline or widen him out horizontally to create more space for the break. Pretty much every route that has a break, at least, boils down to that kind of game. Setting up your routes really just comes down to making the defender think that you're breaking in the opposite direction that you actually are. So when you've got an in-breaking route against off coverage with fairly even leverage, the rocker step is one of the more common and effective salesmanship techniques to set up the break. It's a violent jab step away from the direction of the break. Ideally, you can dramatically swing your hips away from the route because that's what the corner's reading in off coverage. As Thomas accelerates down the stem, gets into his route, the corner's got his eyes glued on his hips because that's the best clue to try to anticipate a route break. Usually it's hard to make really deceptive movements and fakes with your hips because they're kind of tethered to the rest of your body, but really good job by Brian Thomas here of selling this rocker step, gets the defender to open his hips and slide to the outside, and then really crisp footwork to cross his face, separate over the middle, easy touchdown. Well, actually, it should have been an easy touchdown, but this is a good place to highlight one of his few minor weaknesses, which is the occasional focus drop and the occasional double catch, which doesn't actually result in anything bad, but it's kind of indicative of inconsistent hands. Still finished the play, but Brian Thomas Jr. has enough wasted routes on his tape. He doesn't need to make the situation worse by also dropping passes. The traits that make him so effective on slants also translate to lethal rocker steps and similar kind of fakes at the top of the route. It's really, I think, the stride length combined with the lateral explosiveness, where he's not only able to burst at a 90-degree angle, he's able to give a huge dramatic jab step away from his break and then explode back in the opposite direction with almost no lag from the initial route fake. And when he eventually does get out of his break, those first few steps as he accelerates from the top of the route cover so much ground. It's hard enough to keep up with him on the horizontal plane if you're perfectly square and there's no window dressing to set up the route. If you have to rebound from getting your hips turned around or getting driven off of the break point, and you have to keep up with the amount of ground that he covers out of these in breakers, I mean, there just aren't a lot of athletes, even in the NFL, that can really compete with that. I really like this route from the Lions game. Initially, he's got pretty much even leverage. He's running an in breaker, so again, it's all about making the corner think that your route is breaking in the opposite direction than it actually is. He takes a wide stem angle to really force the issue and attack the defender's outside shoulder. He accelerates and continues to attack downfield for about 7 yards. Once he gets a few steps into the route, the defender's kind of forced to open his hips to the sideline. At that point, he just evens back up, starts to work back inside gradually. The DB identifies this and starts to try to recover back to the inside. You can see he throws up this right hand. Sometimes that kind of thing is just a blatant hold, but there is actually something called the slingshot technique where you kind of use this method to not grab and try to restrict the receiver, but take advantage of his momentum and use it to propel yourself back around and get back in phase with the route. But almost in a synchronized motion, as the DB raises his hand, Thomas responds immediately with a wipe or a chop. He slices it down, breaks that point of contact. Meanwhile, he's finished crossing the defender's face and he's fully attacking his inside hip, but then to fully sell the route break, he uses what's called a stair step technique. When you've got the defender in this exact position where he's stacked by 1 or 2 yards, he's on your hip, but he's on the side away from the break. The best way to finish the route here is with the stair step. He's going to jab with his outside foot, and it's important here that he takes this step as vertically as possible. You want to really sell this vertical route and threaten the DB that he's just a couple steps away from getting burned down the field. And then the last part of the stair step, he doesn't fully execute, but you want to give an exaggerated head fake away from the break. So in this situation, he'd want to turn his head and literally lock eyes with the defender. But I mean, even though there's some stuff you could nitpick about the head fake, incredibly effective route. The burst that he has out of these horizontal breaks makes it a little bit less important for him to perfectly set up all of his routes. Obviously, the more deception and nuance he can throw in there, the better. But as long as he's crisp and efficient with his movements, he can kind of get by with just keeping it simple and separating off of pure athleticism. And then one more just really crisp dig route against Houston. Anything in breaking, whether it's digs, slants, posts, he carved up pretty much anybody that tried to cover him on those routes. And then quick slants, like I said, made up nowhere near as much of his route tree as it should have based on how effective they were. It's also a route he ran really well in college. It's the same thing I said with the rocker step, where the stride length alone just allows him to cover so much ground with 1 or 2 steps. But then you combine that with the lateral explosiveness, he just has a really easy time crossing the defender's face and creating separation. I was listening to a Dabo Swinney coaching clinic on receiver releases, just like his background noise. And he said something that I really agree with, which is that the number one critical, non-negotiable skill that a receiver has to have is the ability to win on a quick slant against inside leverage press.
In the NFL, they'll tell if you can't win on a slant route versus any technique presented to you, you can't play.
If you can't do that, at least in the NFL, you really shouldn't be on the field. But luckily, Brian Thomas Jr. has no issues in that regard. A lot of the slants he ran last year were actually from the slot, so you're not getting that tight in-your-face press coverage, but still inside leverage here. Does a great job threatening upfield, attacking the outside shoulder. He doesn't get the corner to open his hips or have an extreme reaction or anything, but simply creating a convincing vertical push is enough to soften the coverage, get the DB on his heels. He's so swift crossing from the outside shoulder to the inside shoulder that by the time he gets out of his break, the DB is leaning too far back on his heels to accelerate and keep up with him. And I mean, after the catch, like that's the other reason you got to feature him on these routes more. You got the biggest, fastest player on the field catching the ball in stride over the middle with pretty much no help to stop him after the catch. Another one from the slot here. This time he's going inside, outside, back in. Good hand usage at the break point to extend separation. Same game here. This time he's matched up with Jarvis Brownlee Jr. Poor guy just stood no chance against Brian Thomas Jr. in either of their matchups. This one's more of a da-da-da-da-da release. Crosses him up with room to spare. And then final slant. This one might technically be too like detailed and complex to actually qualify as a slant. Kind of squares up with him, widens out, attacks upfield, rapidly crosses over. I'm going to be counting his slants next year. He's got to start running more of these. Now, if you just showed me Brian Thomas Jr.'s measurables and I knew nothing about him, and you asked me what I thought he might struggle with, I would probably guess that he's not as effective on curls, stops, comebacks, anything where he's got to decelerate. A lot of these high-cut linear athletes just don't have the hips to stop on a dime the way that you need to separate in the NFL, but that assumption could not be further from the truth. Referencing back to a player like Malik Neighbors, for example, who is probably the best decelerator I've ever seen, maybe in any sport. He just isn't the same type of athlete or mover, but I mean, compared to the standard NFL receiver, Thomas just dices up man coverage with these routes. A big part of what makes these routes so effective is how legitimate that vertical push and that threat downfield is to the corner that's covering him. At the point where he's, 7 or 8 yards down the stem and it still looks like he's close to max speed, as a DB trying to cover him, I mean, you can't have any restraint when it comes to gearing up and accelerating downfield. If you try to guess that he's running a curl and pump the brakes prematurely, he's leaving you in the dust before you even realize what happened, and Trevor Lawrence or Mac Jones is going to overthrow him by 4 yards. So when you're covering him on the vertical plane, you have to have maximum respect for his danger as a deep threat. And that creates such an impactful advantage that most receivers don't really have. The threat of his vertical push just forces defenders to bail so aggressively and really softens the coverage, opens up opportunities underneath. I mean, you look at the way that this DB trails off from his route break, you get basically 5 yards of throttle steps before he's able to come to a stop and try to get back in phase. If you watch probably 85% of NFL receivers run these types of routes, they pretty much never have the DB panicking to this level. So I was just watching Marvin Harrison Jr. and Rome Odunze. Solid players, technically sound route runners, but their top gear is just nowhere close to what Brian Thomas brings to the table. So when they're fully accelerating down the sideline and then they come to a stop, they can do that efficiently, but they're coming to a stop from a much lower initial speed. And in turn, the DB's at a much lower initial speed, so it's easier for him to decelerate and mirror the break. All of that is really just to explain how the mind game element gives Thomas an advantage. You add on the crisp route break, he's got plenty of room to spare with how lost the DB is. Doesn't really push off. It's hard to get a clear picture from this angle, but definitely does something to kind of accentuate him drifting downfield and extend the separation, and then opens back to the quarterback, easy catch. He integrates a lot of the clever tempo changes that he uses on quick slants with these stop routes. Having the ability to slow play your release and really the route the way that he does here, but then at any moment just gear up. He kind of just drifts downfield at the last second, gives a believable enough threat down the sideline. The DB starts to gear up with him, instantly drops his hips, 60-0 in a split second. I think this one was another double catch maybe. He doesn't have a terrible drop rate, but he kind of tests the limit with some of these plays. I mentioned this 7 stop against Miami really early in the video. This was kind of a precursor for the rest of the season. When I saw this play, I was like, oh, we might be getting a much different Brian Thomas Jr. than I was expecting based on his college tape. All right, back here post recording and editing. Was going through looking for extra clips because I needed to fill 30 seconds on the video, and stumbled across this route that I had somehow missed. This is against Sauce Gardner, by the way, who I would say is one of the better corners against stops and comebacks. Same kind of strategy as the stop route that I just showed against Miami. So he's got outside leverage pre-snap. He's going to stem his route directly down the seam, take an inside release based on his relation to the corner. The reason he does that is you can see when he releases inside, that influences Sauce Gardner to open his hips, put his back to the sideline. Really the whole point of his stem is to get Sauce into a side turn. And then once he has his back to the sideline, he now has a blind spot that Brian Thomas can attack. If the corner's squared up with him, his blind spot is technically behind him downfield. So, attacking his blind spot isn't really a thing in that situation. But the initial angle that he takes right down the seam influences the corner's hips. Once he gets him into a side turn, then he can start weaving in and out of the corner's blind spot for the remainder of the stem. So the moment his hips turn, now Thomas is going to start to threaten the outside a little bit more. He accelerates through that outside shoulder, drives him off of the break point, cuts his route off. I remember like a year ago, I watched every Sauce Gardner coverage rep against a stop or a comeback for a video. And I mean, it was just blanket coverage, snap after snap. He doesn't really ever get put in a blender like this. Another good job here of adjusting tempo down the stem and then at the last second attacking the blind spot. The ultimate goal is to pose a convincing threat that you're running a vertical route and try to get him to accelerate as aggressively downfield as you possibly can. An easy way to do that is to get running as fast as possible and then try to come to a complete stop really quickly. But when you've got a defender with his back to the sideline like this, you can use that to your advantage, and Thomas does that right here. So the last phase of his stem before the break, he widens out to the sideline and positions himself so he's right in the defender's blind spot. From the DB's perspective, he doesn't have a full cone of vision of the route. So the last thing that he sees before he loses sight of him is Brian Thomas Jr. turning on the jets, releasing outside, attacking down the sideline. If you actually watch his speed here, he doesn't ever really get up to more than 30% of his max speed. Cutting off the route efficiently doesn't take that much effort because you're not really gearing down from that high of a speed, but the threat within the defender's mind is just as real. So we're gonna have to wrap up with a few negatives, unfortunately. He is human. I think I might have said 2 at the beginning of the video, but there are really 3 key weaknesses to his game as I see it. The first one is outbreaking routes, which were noticeably less effective than inbreakers. For whatever reason, he just doesn't seem to have as good of a feel for manipulating the defender's leverage to set up an outbreaking route. If he's running an out against outside leverage especially, it seems sometimes like he just has nothing in his bag, like no strategy to really go against the grain and create separation. I also noticed that he was a lot more labored and inefficient getting in and out of breaks on like deep outs compared to how crisp and clean everything is on in-breakers. A lot of these routes are essentially the exact same footwork. It's just inverted the opposite direction. Maybe it's a specific like athletic limitation or deficiency that he has where it's just a less natural movement for him to make. But in terms of the sequencing and the technique of everything, you really just got to flip it in your mind. When he uses a rocker step to set up a dig, it works like pretty much every time it seems like, but then he'll use the exact same technique on an outbreaking route and it's like it's happening in slow motion. So I feel similarly about his outbreaking routes as I did about his comebacks and stops and even digs based on his LSU tape. And a year later, I feel like there was I don't know about radical, but considerable development that took place over the course of that year. Really easy to envision Thomas making a similar jump. And at that point, he can run pretty much the complete X route tree at a relatively high level. I didn't think he was a great zone route runner. Felt like there were some pretty clear windows that he needed to sit down in between, and the quarterback was expecting him to be there, and he just kind of like drifted behind a defender. And then when he does break these routes off at the correct depth and width, he needs to be a lot better at working back to the football and presenting a clear passing lane for the quarterback. And then my last real weakness for Brian Thomas Jr. is not even really technically a weakness. It's more just something that kind of left me wanting more about his game. At 6'3" with his catch radius, I was disappointed by the lack of assertiveness and, weaponizing his physical tools at the catch point. I thought his ball tracking skills were outstanding, But outside of that, like really every element of catching the football was kind of a 4 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10 in my opinion. None of it's debilitating, but drop rate is a little bit below average, kind of consistently every year. There's some focus drops. He's had a respectable to slightly underwhelming contested catch rate pretty much every year. Again, nowhere near bad, but also nowhere near as dominant as he's capable of being at the catch point. He's a guy based on his natural talent who should be imposing his will, high pointing the ball, boxing out defenders, establishing catch space. He's kind of just a little bit passive at times in those jump ball situations. That's the part of his game where I think if he can really elevate there and get to like 80th percentile as far as winning at the catch point, however you want to quantify that puts him in the tier of receivers that are approaching unstoppable. Like if you're telling me you get Brian Thomas Jr. exactly as he was last year, but all of a sudden he's a demon at the catch point, there might not be another receiver in the NFL that I would take over him. All right, that's going to do it for the film breakdown. A couple quick things to go through before we get out of here. This is my summarized scouting report, strengths and weaknesses. You can skim through that if you're interested. And then these are my skill ratings for Brian Thomas Jr. I scale these relative to NFL starters, where 50 is adequate for an NFL starter. Anything 75 plus is very good. Anything below 25 is poor. Thomas doesn't even have a single rating below 50, which is pretty uncommon. As you can see, he's got a lot of elite traits and skills. I don't just toss around 90 ratings. Like you got to be pretty special in that area to earn that score. The to-do list for him this offseason is pretty thin relative to most players that are heading into their second year. Step 1, become a dog when the ball's in the air. If he does that, nothing else matters. He's basically reached his ceiling, I think. But tightening up the footwork on those outbreaking routes, I think would really complete his route tree. Want to see more precision and attention to detail running routes against zone coverage. Although, like I said, it was really only a few bad plays and I still gave him an above average rating. So more than adequate there. And then I guess the only other thing I could nitpick is that he isn't overly shifty or elusive after the catch, but I don't exactly know how you fix that or improve that. I think that's kind of what he is. With his speed, he doesn't need to juke people out. Like I said, just give him 4 quick slant targets a game. That's easy yak production right there. All right, that's going to do it for Brian Thomas Jr., one of my favorite players I've studied this offseason. If you couldn't tell. Appreciate you guys tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and a comment. Really helps it in the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate that. If you aren't already, also make sure that you're subscribed, do all that good stuff, and I will see you guys in the next one.